Thank you very much, Ted, and I actually have to thank all the people that came before me because they've done a wonderful job of setting up a lot of the background that I needed you to know about, and no doubt will do a better job than I will. This report here has recently come out in terms of evaluating a whole pile of sediment management options that have been proposed for the estuary. I'm one of the authors of this report. I'm not going to work you through that evaluation today. It's a 300-page report. There's a huge amount of information in there. What I wanted to do was actually go through some of the context and the background and the primary science that we did before we did the evaluations, because I think some of that actually underpins where we got to. In the Q&A, I'm very happy to answer questions about the specific options that were evaluated and some of our findings. I know this has been presented a lot, and I think Marion did such a good job talking about this that I'm just going to say talk to Marion because she did an amazing job. But I think what we need to do first is to start with the story that actually the sediment was always there. This was once upon a time wetland, extensive intertidal vegetation, and extensive wetland and extensive mudflats. So when we look out that window and we see mudflats, that's actually historically the norm of this part of the estuary. It's very different and it's heavily modified because of all the levees and the urban development, but this part of the estuary was always a mudflat dominated estuary. And in fact was quite shallow. So the early descriptions of the channel were a sort of 1.7 metre draft. So quite shallow, and the types of boats, as Marion said, they got stuck twice on the way up to Cataract Gorge. So once they got to the Tamar wetlands, it got very hard to navigate above that into the estuary. A couple more, these ones, and I must say they don't show up well on these slides, but these are just some of the historical surveys, and I've stolen this from the LFA, who did a lovely job of overlaying the current condition onto some of these historical maps and having a look and saying, well, where are the mudflats compared to where they used to be from this old exercises? How have things changed? What we see is a lot of straightening, that the lower North Esk in particular is really heavily impacted. And we saw that, what Ian said really is where it's become this canal, essentially, where we've taken it, we've heavily levied it, we've removed the wetlands in that part of the estuary. Other parts around the Yacht Basin aren't substantially different except for all that infill around really those areas around Royal Park. When we talk about sedimentation management, we can really talk about 4 historic periods in terms of management. The first part was not totally do nothing, but do very little, essentially. So that was where we had the natural state of the estuary. We had water depths where, high tides, we had enough depth for shipping, but we waited for the tide to bring larger ships in. We had extensive mudflats and a narrow, sort of shallow channel. Those 2 cross sections you see there, I've digitised them based off some wonderful big historic things that we found sitting around at City of Launceston, and they really show that shows at King's Wharf what was the depth of the estuary moving across from King's Wharf across the estuary as a straight line. And what we see there is at low tide, which is that little red dotted line, there was actually not very much depth at all. And what we would have seen is quite a lot of mudflat. So all the stuff that's above that dotted line is actually mudflat. Once we got to 1890, we started to have this continuous and ever-increasing dredging program, and that was really about navigability of the estuary. We had a lot of infilling of our floodplains and our wetlands, and a lot of that dredge spoil created Invermay and created some of these suburbs that we're standing on today. I put there the Treval Dam was constructed in 1955. The last of those that I have access to, 1957 is actually the last one. And what you see there is the shape of the channel didn't actually change when Treval Dam went in. That's a dredged channel. It was wide and it was deep because it was dredged to be wide and deep to allow the navigation of those large ships into King's Wharf. In 1965, really we went through then a period where all those big shipping facilities were moved down to Bell Bay. And we've had minimal dredging, so small campaigns came in, targeted things, but not those massive campaigns of history that we saw. In 2012 to 19, we had the sediment raking program. And you see I'm putting the cross sections up over time as we did that. So that old one from 1889 is still there. I've then got those kind of historic, what it looked like while it was being dredged, which is those big, deep, wide ones. When we got to sort of just before the flood, which was very heavily sedimented. So that was during that silt raking period. It was quite heavily sedimented. What we had was actually a deeper channel than we had in 1889. It had shifted away from King's Wharf, obviously, because we've moved that bank. But we actually had less mudflat visible at low tide just in 2016 than we did in 1889. When I throw up then now, so spring 2020, essentially that was last year, it's pretty much the same as the silt raked version. It varies up and down a bit in terms of flood impact, but it's very similar. So we've still got that sort of extensive area of mud, a shallower channel, but actually probably an extra 1/2 metre depth on what we would have had back in the 1880s. Ian's done a great job of explaining tidal prism, but I'll just sort of show you this little bit over here, which also doesn't show up very well. But that's just looking at the digital elevation model. So we can sort of look at tidal prism. In some areas, it's the area that gets flooded with that tide as it moves in and out. When we take what we call a digital elevation model, we can look at where that's calculated. Bits of that get cut off if we start to put in things like tidal levees. So we have areas that are below the high tide, and there's areas of Invermay, for example, that are still below high tide, but they no longer get flooded because we've got tidal levees, and that's tidal prism that's been lost. Ian explained this one too, which is quite useful. So this is that regime equilibrium that he talked about, this relationship that's been developed to describe how a cross-section relates to this tidal prism. The other thing that affects the shape of the estuary is really this floods. So we talked about the impacts of floods coming through. So we know that very large floods scour very large volumes of sediment. What you see there is the 2016 flood. That was about 265,000 cubic metres of sediment that got moved out of this part of the estuary. That's a 2,000 cubic flood down the South Esk. What we do know is that we need about 150 cubics down the South Esk to scour. So anything under that, we won't get sort of bed scour happening. But once we do get that 150, it scours very rapidly. So we lose sediment out of that system very quickly. These slides are actually missing titles, and all sorts of things are actually disappearing off slides, which is very strange. So when we're investigating these, one of the things we did do is we did a huge amount of work going back over bathymetry and primary data sources and really saying, how has the shape changed? How does it change through here? What does it relate to? And how does it change over time in response to some of these events? We took some of the bathymetry data and we looked at what does the cross-section of that part of the estuary look like, and that's actually just a measure in that part of Cataract Gorge. We then looked at other cross-sections moving through the estuary to understand how this shape, which is also then relates to the sediment, actually changes. It's hard to see, but I've actually had to compress Cataract Gorge there because it's very narrow. But what you see is we go from very deep, very, very deep in Cataract Gorge to a much more extensive and wide area in the Yacht Basin. So, the predicted tidal regime equation. O'Brien's equation works really, really well for the North Esk. It's a really good description of how that cross-sectional area is actually maintained in the North Esk. It actually doesn't describe the Yacht Basin at all, and what we actually see is a completely different relationship that occurs in the Yacht Basin, which is this bit going down. This bit here, so the upper estuary is actually, when we look at the data, it's dominated by what we call a fluvial process. So fluvial process is essentially around how rivers are shaped. Rivers are shaped by large flood events. So when we look at a river system, we look at very large flood events, they scour massive amounts of sediment, and that's what maintains their size. They're not based on their sort of base flow. When we get into the lower North Esk, it's very much dominated by that tidal prism relationship. That describes the shape of the North Esk really well. When we get into Home Reach, there's a little bit of a crossover. We can still see an influence from the fluvial sort of relationship into that first part of Home Reach, but as we get down to about King's Wharf, it's definitely very much tidal prism dominated. This has implications for how things have changed, but also how we can influence them. In terms of the changes in the tidal prism, we have seen massive differences in tidal prism that have affected the North Esk in particular and home reach and areas below home reach in the estuary. We see that those things would have had massive impacts on those parts of the estuary, but very minimal impacts on the Yacht Basin. The next thing to look at then is the role of Treval Dam in sediment. So a lot of people tell you that the sediment has been there because of Treval Dam. So Treval Dam caused the sediment is a very common cry. So we did look at how did Treval Dam actually impact on flows and what likely impact has that had on sediment. So the first thing to note is that Treval Dam is actually pretty small. In terms of storages, it's actually a really small storage. It passes anything that's moderate to large in terms of flows. When we look at and we investigate, so this is essentially the probability, that's the number of days per year with flow at or below a certain level, and the other one is actually the flow. So over that time series, when we actually analyse that and we look at the difference between with and without Treval Dam, we've had no impact at all on the number of really large events. So those big flat scouring events haven't been impacted. We've had 5 fewer days, so there's a few days per year less of those sort of 150 to 290, so the smaller scouring events. We have some days where we've actually now got more flow than we would have had under natural conditions. So under natural conditions, we would have had dry periods where there were no flow or very minimal flows for some days per year. But the biggest impact has really been on those small flushing events. So the stuff that's up to about 100 cumecs, that's where Treval Dam's really had an influence. The other thing that it's done is it's actually added quite a lot of freshwater inflow into the estuary. So the Treval Dam's actually fed by water that would have otherwise gone to the Derwent through the Powhatan power station. So we've got a much larger volume of freshwater that now enters the estuary because of that network, essentially. And there has been some studies done saying that that additional water that comes largely through the tail races actually slows upstream migration of sediment in the estuary. I think for me, one of the things that came out of this was that a lot of the community memory and people sort of saying Treval Dam did it probably is the coincidence that they actually stopped massive large-scale dredging at the same time as they put a dam in. And the data doesn't support the position that the dam actually created the sediment. Okay, so what happens if we do nothing? We've looked at lots and lots of cross-sectional areas, and what we find is they're actually pretty stable. They jump up and down with flood events, and then they kind of go back to about where they are. So if we did nothing, we would probably get pretty much what we've got at the moment. In terms of channel depths and mudflats, when we look at it, it's sort of stabilised again post-sediment raking. So sediment raking knocked visible sediment out of mudflats and deposited it in channels. Those channels have now re-scoured and they've settled out in mudflats. That's why you can see more sediment, but there actually isn't more sediment there. So pretty much if we did nothing, it'd look an awful lot like it does right now, which is very extensive mudflats at low tide. What it would do, so this is some of the tea tree, if we left the sediment alone, we would, over time, start to get some of the intertidal vegetation re-established. And you can actually see that happening on the North Esk. If you stand here, there's quite a lot of reeds coming back on the sides of the North Esk. You'd start to get more of that happening along the tea tree on the western side, and we'd get more of that transition back to a more natural state where it was sort of water, mud, intertidal vegetation, and then our tea tree. So if we did nothing, over time, that's where it would go to. In terms of evaluating, so when we looked at the options, we evaluated them across a lot of criteria. And one of the first things we did is said, well, why are we managing sediment? What is the problem and why is it a problem? The first thing is that they're not actually a sign of an unhealthy estuary. So the community perception that mudflats are a bad thing and that they're a sign of an unhealthy estuary is not right. They're actually a really important habitat in an estuary. They protect water quality. They protect the shore vegetation from erosion. So you can see that tea tree falling in. That's because a lot of the mudflats were disturbed. They're actually an essential source of food for migratory birds. And The kanamaluka Tamar is actually internationally recognised for its bird species. This is the upper estuary, not the lower estuary. All those beautiful things in the lower estuary. The upper estuary is actually internationally recognised as an important bird area because of our mudflats. So from an environmental point of view, that's not why we would manage them. So would we do it for estuary health? No. They're not a problem from an environmental point of view. The perception of increased flood risk, and we looked at this really closely. Do they increase flood risk? And the answer is not really. They can, for very small flood events, increase flood level to a small amount, a couple of centimetres, but that doesn't pose a risk. We have a levee system that actually protects us against those increases in flood. Large floods scour really large volumes of sediment. It is a freight train that comes and just pummels its way straight through that sediment. So that sediment being there isn't a flood risk. Does it impact on community values? And this is the yes. This is the management driver really for talking about sediment. The concerns, and these concerns as we saw went right back to the 1840s, navigation and access. It's always been the main driver for talking about sediment. And aesthetics. At the end of the day, people don't like looking at the mud, and that's often the community concern around why we should fix the mud. Where we sort of ended things was really around, well, if we were to kind of step back and look at this from an international best practice point of view, would we actually think about it as a sediment management problem? And in reality, if we were looking at best practice, we would actually step back and we say, well, we don't actually have a sediment problem. And if we focus on managing the sediment, what we're not doing is actually managing the coastal zone. And really, we need to start moving the conversation onto a discussion about managing the coastal zone for multiple benefits. These are the environmental values it has, as well as the sorts of things that the community wants to do with it. So we do value it for recreation. We value the aesthetics. We're worried about floods. All those things are the sorts of things that we need to balance when we're talking about management. The more up-to-date way of thinking about these things is really using an integrated coastal zone management approach. So this is where you start to try and balance out those different factors. How do we balance the environmental, the economic, the social, the cultural, the recreational? So put all of those values together. And then we think about the limits set by natural dynamics. Sometimes we just can't make systems do things they're not designed to do, and we probably shouldn't try and make them do things they're not designed to do. So work with nature is definitely a lot easier than working against it. The sorts of principles that you look at are about transparency, looking at risk assessments, including social values and including the community in the conversation, like Ted was talking about. Appropriate scale. So if we have an issue of flood risk to a particular piece of infrastructure, should we look at large-scale dredging of the estuary, or should we look at modifying the piece of infrastructure to minimise the flood risk to that infrastructure? So sometimes it's about trying to figure out what is the scale of the problem and what's the nature of the problem, and then what's the appropriate scale and nature of the intervention. Underpinned by a sound ecological understanding, so we know what we're doing and we know what we're giving up if we do those things. And then to provide those clear structures amongst agencies. So getting that governance and the institutional stuff that Ted was talking about right. So it is a really multi-pronged way of looking at it and stepping back from it as an issue of sediment to an issue of coastal zone management. And that's down the back.
Good.